Both President Trump and President Biden like to boast about the prosperity that they brought to our country, but in crisscrossing America myself, I'm not seeing evidence of that prosperity. Instead, I'm seeing an America that I never thought that I'd witness. I'm seeing these giant disparities in wealth where most Americans are living on the precipice of desperation. In fact, the average income in this country is now $5,000 less than the basic cost of living, and 35% of Americans are not making enough money to pay for basic human needs. That means transportation, food, and housing. What that means is that they have to make impossible choices every day of their lives. American parents today all across our country are sitting in their living room and listening to a baby cry in the room next door and having to wonder whether that baby is $30 sick or $200 or $500 sick before they bring them to a hospital. They're choosing between medicine and food and gasoline and rent. And in order to bridge that gap between their income and their needs, Americans are increasingly relying on their credit cards. We now have the greatest credit card debt in America's history. Credit card debt is $300 billion more than when President Trump took his oath of office. And the average interest rate on that credit card debt is around 22%. When the mafia does that, they call it loan sharking. When banks do it, they just call it interest. If we're doing so well, then why is it today that 57% of Americans could not put their hands on $1,000 in order to pay for an emergency? And for the first time in American history, most Americans, in fact, 2/3 of us, believe that our children will be worse off than we are today. For most Americans, the American dream has turned into an American nightmare. And whatever graphs and data and statistics that government officials use to try to gaslight us into believing that everything is hunky-dory, reality is written across this country on the plywood that is boarding up all of these closed businesses from Main Street to Union Square in San Francisco, and it's etched on the faces of the mothers and fathers who gather weekly at their kitchen table to go through the bills and try to figure out how in the world they're going to make their ends meet. And that kitchen table math seems a lot more reliable than the sunny economic projections that we're getting from our elected officials of both political parties in the White House. Because every American family knows in its bones that these tales of a booming economy don't add up. The last two administrations, like several of the administrations that preceded them, have continued to adopt policies that favor Wall Street and tech billionaires and military contractors over the American middle class. Those interests are strip mining America of its equity, of its wealth, of its salaries, and ultimately of our democracy. And both President Trump and President Biden are now running for re-election based upon these economic choices. And what that means is that if either of them get elected, you can expect more of the same. We seem to have plenty of money for all the bank bailouts and the foreign wars, but food stamps for ordinary Americans are being cut by 90%, and teachers across the country are paying for school supplies out of their own pocket. It's time that Americans got a president who cared about their economy and not the war economy and the bank economy and the finance economy and the Wall Street economy, and not the theoretical economy on the charts and graphs. Over the coming weeks, I'll be releasing an economic plan that focuses on ending this corrupt merger between state and corporate power that has made the 6 essential expenses unaffordable for most Americans. And those essential expenses are housing, food, childcare, utility bills, commuting to work, and getting the medical care that you need to survive. I want every American to know that you are not alone in this crisis. I want you to know that I'm going to be a president who's going to be thinking about solving your economic problems every day that I'm in the White House. The government created these problems, and you deserve a government that is going to solve them.
You're a lifelong Democrat, and yet they're interested in you advancing to a debate with Joe Biden, which doesn't look like it's going to happen.
We're going to try to get the president debate. We think it's really important. And it's important for, I think, the Democratic Party, because ultimately the president is going to have to debate a Republican, and the Republican likely is going to be Trump. you need practice.
Sure.
And that usually happens during the primary. And asking, the president not to debate during the primary is like asking a prize fighter to practice for his big bout by sitting on a couch and eating Chick-fil-A.
Do you think Joe Biden is afraid to debate you?
I don't know what's happening with President Biden. I think it's important for the country that we have debates. There are so many Americans who feel that the system is rigged and that, the parties are picking like they did in the Soviet Union and telling people who they're going to vote for. At this time in history, it's really important to persuade the American people that democracy works, that we're all participants, and that people can look at the different candidates and make a rational choice. If you like this video and you want to help me become president of the United States, go to Kennedy24.com and donate now.
I feel like the whole country needs to know what's going on here. It's bigger than alarming.
This is the worst I've ever seen it.
I witnessed this dystopian nightmare of this uncontrolled flow of desperate humanity crossing the border and converging here because of misbegotten policies by high leadership of the United States.
When President Biden took office, he signed some executive orders that basically halted all wall construction. It put our agents at risk, it put the migrants at risk, it incentivized the profit making for the smugglers.
At the end of the day, this is a business. Billions and billions of dollars every month are earned from transporting people across into the United States.
These kids are being exploited all along this track. There's nothing humane about any of this.
In this room, obviously, we designed it to be as comfortable as we can possibly make it, because the reality is no child should ever have to come to this exam room.
Señora y mi hija están conmigo, pero mi hija de 18 años, no sé dónde está.
We see a lot of violence as people are making across the border through Mexico or their countries. We see that devastation in the human lives.
What happens if the family doesn't have the money to buy the plane ticket?
Well, FEMA reimburses us. We can buy that ticket and
So you buy the ticket for them?
Yes.
They were told they could get a bite at the American dream here, and that dream becomes a nightmare along the journey.
Hey, everybody, I'm at the border wall around Yuma, Arizona. It's about 2 o'clock in the morning. We've watched about 150 people come across. You can see the end of the wall down there. And we've watched about 150 people come across in the last hour. The first group were about 50 or 60 people from Africa, from West Africa. This group that is filing behind me right now, we interviewed many of them. They're from Peru, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, China, Tibet, Nepal, and all together, people have come across right here from 117 nations in the last couple of years. In 3 years, in total, 7 million people have come across the border illegally into our country. And from here, they're put on these buses and they're brought to the Border Patrol station where they're processed. After 4 or 5 days, they're released on their own reconnaissance into our country, and most of them are never seen or heard from again. And the stories that we heard from these people are absolutely heartbreaking. This is a humanitarian crisis because of the understanding across the globe that we now have an open border here. There are people being drawn here, they're being abused, there's all kinds of just horrific, terrible, terrible stories, and this is not a good thing for our country. It's not a good thing for these people, and it is unsustainable.
Everybody in this country, everybody in this room were told things that turned out to be absolutely false. If you take the vaccine, you're never going to get COVID. You take the vaccine, you're not going to infect other people. They had one broad general health policy. Take the shot, take the boosters. And meanwhile, they never considered or factored in natural immunity. If you brought it up, you were beaten up, publicly. The pressure that was brought to bear on me to tell people what they should do was unrelenting. And I'm not a doctor. I don't know people's medical histories, pre-existing conditions, comorbidities, and I'm not qualified, so I didn't tell them what to do. I said, talk to your doctor, make an informed decision. But you think the whole thing was that bad that what?
We've had the WHO, CDC, the DHS, and they've worked very, very carefully on pandemic preparedness protocols. And all of those protocols said you never lock down a population. First of all, you cannot stop a respiratory virus with lockdowns. You're going to actually amplify it because they spread indoors. And what all the orthodox protocols said is that you quarantine the sick, you protect the vulnerable, and that you let the population continue, because when you shut down businesses, that kills people. Unemployment kills people.
In retrospect, what would you have done differently?
I would have done everything differently. I mean, number one, doctors and physicians who are trying to say, hey, I'm using a treatment, a protocol that actually works. I'm using therapeutics that work. Those people are silenced. We should have done the opposite and have them report what treatments were they using, what was working. We know now there were dozens and dozens of therapeutic drugs that were off-the-shelf drugs that obliterate.
Are you talking about HCQ? Are you talking about ivermectin?
Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, many others. The problem was not only did they not focus on those, but they tried to prevent the public from getting access to them. You don't know about those studies because the press is not reporting them. If you like this video and you want to help me become President of the United States, go to Kennedy24.com and donate now.